Good day. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to generate variables in STATA. So other than running your basic summary statistics, which we have covered in the previous video, we are also interested in, or well, more often than not, will be asked to generate additional variables in your data set, conditional on certain variables, or conditional on the values of certain variables, and that's what we're going to do here. Right, so we're going to cover a couple of commands. We're going to cover clone var. We're going to cover generate. We're going to cover egen. And towards the end of this video, I'm going to show you how to run a basic regression analysis. Okay, so let's start off with the generate command. But before that, let me just write the code here. Let's start off with our code. You always start with the code, right? So basic generating variables is data. And not just generating, we're also going to manipulate data sets and manipulate the data set here. So let's try to again use the folder. Let's try to use this folder again. Use Woolridge data set. Let me just copy the file path. This is much easier. It allows you to call the data sets, allows you to call the files easier without writing the entire path. Okay. So let's try to use, say, wage2.pta. So let's use wage2.pta. I would normally type clear just to be sure, just to ensure that I'm unloading the dataset that's previously loaded in the system, right? So the clear option will unload the previous dataset and load the dataset that you're trying to call, right? So let's try to run this, and we already have this dataset, right? So before we generate anything, maybe you're just an aside and you're just curious how to sort. Maybe you're just curious how to sort variables or how to sort the values in your STATA interface. So it looks like this. Maybe you wanted to sort the variables based on, say, the size of wage, right? Or based on the value of wage from smallest to highest. So if you wanted to sort, just an aside, sorting variables, and this is very handy later on. Right, so if you wanted to sort the variables, so you just type sort wage, right? And if you check the data, it now runs from the smallest, right, smallest to largest value. Right? You can also do a descending sort. Normally, I would just type g sort wage, negative wage. And then do the same, and you now have largest to smallest sorting, right? It's going to be handy later on if you have several groups, right? You can also do that that kind of group sorting, right? But we will do that later on, right? So generating new variables, right? There are a couple of ways to generate new variables, and depends on the purpose. So for instance, if you wanted to just say get a exact copy of your variable without any changes, right? And if you wanted to include the variable labels, there's this command called clone var. So when you type clone var, just input the desired name, the name that you wanted for the new variable. So let's say you wanted to use work hours. Hours is work hours, right? So let me check the variables. Average weekly hours. So suppose I wanted to I just want to have a copy of this hour variable. So let's type week HR. So that's the new name. That's the new variable name, and just type in hours. Right? New variable and the old variable. So when you run this, you will have an additional variable at the end, right? That is the exact same variable as work hours. And if you try to get the summary stats of those two variables, so week R and hours, they're totally identical. And so let's say sum. So they're totally identical. So you can check that by looking at its distribution. So you have the exact standard deviation, you have the exact mean, minimum value, maximum value, and number of observations. So that's clone var. Now there's a more general way to create an additional variable in your data set, right? And allows you to do some conditional, it allows you to include some logical commands, or it allows you to set some certain conditions, right? So for instance, I wanted to say get the log, another variable for log wage. There's a log wage variable here, but suppose I just wanted to get, say, the log of, I wanted to get a variable that computes for the log of tenure, for example, log of years of tenure, or let's just use experience. So suppose I wanted to get log, or I wanted to get the log of experience. Take note that in Stata, ln and log are used interchangeably. So they both refer to your natural logarithm. So I wanted, say, to generate log of experience. So if I wanted to get log of experience, I'll just type generate, or shorthand gen. I normally type generate, but matter of preference, you wanted to make it shorter, just type gen. The new variable name, let's say L experience, and that would be log of the variable experience. So new variable, old variable. So run this, and then you now have the new variable L experience. And if you wanted to examine that variable, you just type sum L experience. Okay. So notice that I'm running the codes from here, right? So it allows me to plan ahead. And if you're, in case you're wondering, I'm not using this execute button anymore. I'm just using the keyboard because it's much faster. So that's log. That's using log. Now, what if you wanted to get the sum of two rows, and two variables rather? So suppose you wanted to get the sum. Suppose you wanted to get, say, the hypothetical variable. Suppose you wanted to multiply wage by 1,000, but of course, you don't normally do that. So you can use the same generate function. So say wage 1K, right? Wanted to multiply wage by 1,000, and typical arithmetic operation works with generate, right? But of course, that's not really useful. That's not really useful. Now, if you wanted to drop this variable, just type drop wage 1K. I can drop that. What else? You can also generate counts. You can also generate a sequential. You can also generate the sequential variable, right? In your data set. Basically, it counts. Starts the count from 1 down to the last observation, and you can also do it in groups. So if you wanted to, say, get the count, you wanted to get the count, you generate a sequential number from running from 1 down to the last observation. You can do so by using count. So let's by using the function sum. So let's say you wanted to get a sequential variable. You just type gen count equals sum 1. This will come in handy later on, right? So see, it now generates a sequential variable. It runs from observation 1 down to observation 935. Okay. Now, there are certain instances wherein your common arithmetic, right? Common arithmetic commands just won't cut it, right? So sometimes you may need to, say, get the average, or you're interested in getting the sample average. You wanted to use that as a variable, or say you wanted to get the average or the totals across groups, right? You can do that in a summary stats, fine. In a summary statistics table, that's fine. But there are instances wherein you're going to need to generate you need to add it in your data set. So to do so, we have what we call the egen command. Right? You can get the entire list of functions available for egen by typing help egen. But here in this exercise, I'm just going to show you how to generate variables, how to generate special variables using egen. So suppose I wanted to generate a variable that contains the average wage, right? So if I wanted to get the average wage, I'll just type egen have wage, for example, and just type mean wage. So if I do this, I will get the average wage across all observations. So let me just type browse wage. And this variable now contains the average wage, right? And it basically appends it in the data set, or merges it in the data set. So you have you have a variable that contains the average wage across all observations. Now, the nice thing about egen is that you can do it in groups, right? You can do it in groups. So let me drop average wage first, right? And suppose I wanted to generate a variable that computes for the average wage across, um, let's say, years of education. Let's say years of education. Suppose I wanted to generate the mean wage by educational by years of education. So to do so, right, I'm going to use the option by, right? So state is pretty straightforward in terms of its language. So if I wanted to do this, I'll just type by. Just to be sure, it's actually state is quite strict with the sorting. So by sort edu, right? So you're telling Stata to compute for the wage by years of education, which is captured by the variable edu. So egen av wage edu, right? So this new variable, right? Just type the mean wage. If I do this, right, and let me just browse edu. Let's try to browse edu wage edu. You'll see that it'll show you basically the average. It'll show you the average wage per years of according to years of education. So if your years of education is 9 years, your average wage will be around 774. When it's 10, it's 719, and so on. Now, just to double check if you got the correct values, you can do so by typing. Let's check if the average values are correct. You can do so by typing tabstat wage, not average wage, because that's already the new variable that you created. So let's try to check if the average wage is generated correctly by edu. Okay. And it turns out that we got it correctly. So if you compare it side by side, right, when you have 9 years of education, you have 774.3. When you have 10 years of education, that's 719. When it's 11, that's 818.81, and so on, down to 12825 for 18 years of education. Okay. Not You can also compute for the totals. Actually, you can also compute for the totals. Right. Suppose you wanted to get hypothetically. Suppose you wanted to get the total. Um, you wanted to get the total years of experience. Right. Hypothetical variable total years of experience by education. Right. You'll do the same thing. And so by sort educ, you still use egen, total experience, for example, so that you'll just have to type um, total experience. And let's try to browse it later on after the variable is generated. Look, total experience. And again, just to check, you can type tab stat experience by eduk, and you indicate what stat. This time it's not the average, you just wanted to get the totals, so the stat should be specified here. The stat is sum. Okay, so let's try this. Okay, get total years of education. Let's run the do file. And as it turns out, we have generated the variables correctly. So hypothetical variables, so 179. Doesn't really make sense, but it doesn't really make sense. Adding the total years of experience by education doesn't really make sense, but it shows you, at least in a mechanical way, it shows you how to use the egen command to generate variables disaggregated by groups, which is essential. It's going to be essential when you do some advanced statistical work. So we can just drop total experience because, well, it's not really useful. It's not really relevant. Okay. So what else? There are a lot of things that you can do with egen. You can also compute for, say for instance, you have two variables. Suppose you have two variables. Age, and again, another hypothetical variable. Let's try to add eduk and experience. Right? Suppose you wanted to add education and experience. To do so, you can use two things. You can either type generate eduk experience, eduk plus experience, but it's not really advisable because if you have missing observations, right, it won't treat those missing as 0. It will treat the entire observation as missing. So to get away with that, you just use egen eduk exper row total eduk experience. And it gives you the total, the sum of education and experience, years of experience. So to check, you can just type browse eduk experience and the new variable eduk experience. So see, the totals are equal. So totals, you have 9 plus 19, you have 28. So it generates the new variable. Okay. If you have a couple, if you have a group of sort of homogeneous variables, of course, it depends on the data set. If you have a group of homogeneous variables, and so you wanted to get the minimum or distributional characteristics per row, say the percentile, you wanted to get the mean, you wanted to get the minimum, the maximum, the standard deviation, you can do so by using the specified row command. Right? So let me just show you what else you can use. What else you can use with egen? What other functions? So you have a list of functions here. You just have to read through the instructions on how to specify them correctly. Right? So you have your row mean, your row median. This is getting the median, mean, and median right across all columns or all variables. If you wanted to get, say, the mean across all observations, then you have the mean and the median. Right? So you have a specific function depending on your purpose. Okay, so that's how you generate variables. Now, how do we run regressions? Right? How do you run basic regressions? Now that we already have the variables, now that we know how to generate, at least in a basic sense, how to generate variables and add them in our data set to run a basic linear or estimate linear model. Estimate a linear model, it's really simple. So just type in regress, right? Set your dependent variable, L wage, right? So normally you start off with the dependent variable and you include the other, you include your set of regressors or your independent variables. So let's say we wanted to include education and experience, right? And it will easily show you the regression results. along with its output. Okay. So that actually concludes our short session on how to generate variables, how to add variables in your data set. In the next video, I'm going to show you how to do basic plots, right? So we don't just crunch numbers, you don't just generate regression results like this. We also are also capable of creating nice plots, right, that will supplement our analysis.